people talk about targeted therapies, if you had to explain that to someone who wasn't quite sure what that meant, and give us an example of what's a targeted therapy, what's not targeted, and how do the drugs differ? What's a targeted drug and what's not?
Many of the chemotherapeutics are not so targeted, and they're given broadly to all the patients.
So adriamycin is not targeted.
Adriamycin, I'm going to say, is not targeted, and generally.
Adriamycin is a flamethrower.
Right.
Okay.
Well, it works for fast-growing cancers.
Okay.
This is yeah.
Okay. All right.
Let me take this one. Just about every one of these drugs has a target. It's targeted in that sense and treats patients. Yeah. Now, what we're really talking about here, it's shorthand, it's an inaccurate term. What we're really talking about is I think this has been talked about here a lot at this meeting. About 30 years ago, genes were discovered that are primarily responsible for the development of tumors. They're called oncogenes or cancer genes. What's happened in the last 10 years is we've been able to detect these very easily and cheaply in patients. We've developed an understanding of in some cases, of which of these genes, if you inhibit it, the tumor will go away. For some of these proteins, we've developed drugs that work effectively and efficiently, and all that's necessary. So I know this is a breast cancer meeting, but I'm going to say this is true for every single cancer we have. I'll give you an example from lung cancer. There's a gene called ALK, which was discovered about 2 years ago to be mutated in about 3% of lung cancers. Now that doesn't sound like very much, but it's about 10,000 patients a year, most of whom are going to succumb to the disease. There's a drug that was found serendipitously to inhibit ALK. If you give that drug to patients with lung cancer with an ALK mutation, the tumor implodes. It's a remarkable thing. The tumor, it rarely goes away completely, but you get 90% regressions. If you gave the ALK inhibitor to anybody else, and actually this is a gene that's mutated in neuroblastoma a lot, in some cases of lymphoma. So you don't treat now, it's very simple-minded, we don't treat lung cancer. We treat ALK-dependent cancer with an ALK drug. It's not going to work anywhere else. Now in breast cancer, there's a pathway of genes called the PI3 kinase pathway. There are a lot of people in this room working on that. That is a very prominently mutated and activated pathway in breast cancer.
So you mean this is a set of genes that make the cells grow? Is that what we're talking about when we say a pathway?
I like to describe it as a circuit. You press a button, the computer goes on. You press a button on the cell surface, the cell divides. These circuits become activated in cancer, particular circuits. If you find out the circuit that's activated in the particular tumor and have a drug against that, it's going to work.
So what in breast cancer is an example of that now?
The two major examples of that are this PI3K circuit, which is often activated by HER2, and the estrogen receptor circuit. Those are the two main growth circuits that we've identified in breast cancer that we can inhibit.
Well, the HER2
and we also have HER2 amplification.
So HER2 is the thing that you you get Herceptin for.
Okay, I'll emphasize it's a circuit. HER2 activates this PI3K pathway. In other breast cancers, you don't need the HER2. You have a mutation of the PI3K gene particularly. In both kinds of cancer, if you had, and this is a little bit of a stumbling block that is being overcome, knowing that is nice, but we need a really effective, specific drug that will inhibit that pathway selectively and by itself, and that will inhibit it in the patients. And we are about to have that in breast cancer. We already have inhibitors of HER2, which is why the patients in which the pathway is activated by HER2, we already have have gotten considerable clinical advances.
So when we're talking about targeted drugs, then we're talking about drugs that are going after things caused by particular mutations.
Or any particular process in the cell that is actually driving the cancer. Estrogen receptor, most people think, is not mutated. In prostate cancer, androgen receptor is usually not mutated, but it is an element, it is a thing that is driving the cancer. And so drugs targeted against that tend to work. And the revolution that brings promise to the treatment of metastatic disease is we've gotten 5 or 6 or 7 of these in different cancers over the last 5 years. Every time we have a drug directed against one of them, we get extraordinary clinical results.
It looked like Dr. Sledge wanted to say something about this, and then Dr. Davidson.
So I just take it from a very simple clinical standpoint. My definition of targeted therapy is pretty simple. There is a molecular target. You can measure it in the clinic, that's to say in real patients. Interfering with that target affects the growth of the cancer cell and is associated with outcome. And that's a clinician's definition of targeted therapy. And for practical purposes in breast cancer, today that means estrogen receptor and HER2. Though, as Neal has suggested, we're on the cusp of targeting many other things in breast cancer.
Okay.
I think the only other point I would add to that is that our hope and our findings so far is that these things are relatively specific for breast cancer cells or cancer cells, and we don't see them in normal cells, so that you hope that this gives you a really favorable risk-benefit ratio. Lots of benefits, not so many risks, and that's another key part of targeted therapy.
And I just wanted to add, I think there's a whole nother set of targets and pathways, and that a lot of people in this room are being funded to look at, and that's the inflammatory pathways, really understanding that the tumor is a product of its environment, and so there's a lot of things that we can target in the environment. Abyssal talked about that yesterday. A number of people talked about inflammatory markers, so that there are some tumors that are going to be mutation-driven, and there may be a whole other pathway that's really driven by this inflammation or the signals that are set in the environment. So again, cleaning up the neighborhood may be a very important strategy for getting rid of the criminals.